Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to Seeding Liberation on the Land. This is the first gathering in the series Food, Farming and Healing Our World. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be exploring how our approaches to food and farming can dramatically transform our relationships with soil, and society to creating thriving lives for people everywhere. My name's Ruby and I'm a co-founder of Advaya, a community interest company and a platform for transformative education, creating online courses and as well as in-person gatherings and retreats that explore the relationships between ecology and well-being. We're really excited to be collaborating with Chelsea Green Publishing on this series, and all of our speakers are one of their published authors. So you can get hold of their books on their website, as well as those of many others who are all exploring the politics and practice of sustainable living. So the panel today is moderated by Abby Rose, part of the brilliant podcast Farmerama, and we're truly honoured to be joined by Dr. Vandana Shiva, Leah Penniman and Chris Smaje. So I'll pass over to Abby to introduce everyone. Thanks so much, Abby.
Thanks, Ruby. And thanks, Chelsea Green and Advaya for having us all. And I just want to say it feels like a real honor and pleasure and privilege to be here moderating this panel with Leah, Vandana, and Chris. And I think I was sharing with you all beforehand, but you're all writing transformative narratives that we are all, able to live into. And I really appreciate the impact you're having on the world and all that you share with us all. So thank you for being here. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So first up, I'm going to do a little introduction to each of you, just for anyone who doesn't know, and then we'll get stuck in. So first up, I was going to share about Leah Penniman. Leah's co-director and manager at Soulfire Farm in New York State. And Leah wrote the book Farming While Black, which, yeah, as I said, it's been a life-changing book for me. Leah shares so many insights in the book, from soil health insights at Soulfire Farm, as well as charting the hugely influential impact of many Black practitioners and producers in the agroecological farming movement, something that's so often overlooked, basically. So yeah, I really appreciate everything Leah brings. And then Chris Smaje, a farmer and social scientist. Chris has been a key thinker in the UK farming scene for many years, and I've always really appreciated his blog and many of the ideas you've been sharing. So it's really exciting to see that you've just published a book, A Small Farm Future. Small Farm Future makes the case for a society built around local economy, self-provisioning agricultural diversity, and a shared earth. So yeah, I'm really enjoying digging into that. And then Vandana Shiva. Vandana is an Indian scholar, food sovereignty advocate, and author of many books, including her latest book, Oneness versus the 1%. It's a fascinating read where Vandana highlights this vicious cycle of the ever richer robber barons who are diminishing democracy and imposing their techtopian worldview on us all. And she really calls us to rise up against this and recognize we're part of the natural world and not separate from it. And I'll let each of them explain much more about their thinking. So where I wanted to start tonight really is, looking to the title of this event. From each of your perspectives, I was going to invite you each to talk for about 10 minutes. What does seeding liberation on the land look like to you? And so I'll start by inviting Leah to share.
Thank you so much. Peace, everyone. It's Leah, Soulfire Farm. Well, I'll tell you in the most immediate sense that we have a youth program called Liberation on Land. And so in the very immediate sense, what it looks like is a whole bunch of beautiful Black and brown teenagers aged 12 to 16 who are committed to repairing ancestral trauma, recommitting to belonging to the earth, and getting together with mentors to learn how to farm, how to cook, how to take care of the forest, bring back pollinators, save seeds, and be in sacred community. So liberation on land in a tangible sense is that. But to zoom out, my wonderful daughter Nishima, who's going to turn 18 this weekend, when she was a small child, she said, "The food system is everything it takes to get sunshine onto your plate." And this is such a beautiful image for me, thinking about photosynthesis incarnate and all the steps that it takes to nourish ourselves, from the land itself to the seed, the soil, the water, the workers, the people who process and aggregate and distribute and cook our food. So this is the food system. And when we think about liberation, to me, we have to really make sure that that is applying to every single aspect of the food system. And both in the US and also globally, tragically, we have an incredibly unjust and ecologically destructive food system. We have a situation here where I live where 98% of the arable land is owned by one racial group, and that's the descendants of Europeans. And this is because of a legacy of genocide, of land theft, of preventing people of color from owning land. And then finally, when Black and brown folks were allowed to own land, to hit them with discrimination from the USDA, from white supremacist groups who perpetuate lynchings and burnings and drive people off their land. So we have a huge issue with land grabbing and the concentration of land ownership, and now dealing with corporations speculating on land, and just really a disaster. When we look at labor here, farm workers do not have the same rights under the law as the rest of workers in the United States, which we trace back to the 1930s with the exclusions and the New Deal worker protections. Over 85% of the people who are growing the food are folks of color, yet less than 3% of the farms are managed by people of color. And we have COVID outbreaks, we have worker abuses, wage theft, and many other exploitations of farm workers, right? If we look at who's getting to eat the food, we have a situation of food apartheid, where your geography, the neighborhood you live in, is the leading determiner of your life expectancy in the United States. And Black and brown folks are disproportionately impacted by hunger, diabetes, heart disease, kidney failure, all these diet-related illnesses, not because of poor choices, that's a myth, but because that food is not culturally appropriate, affordable, accessible in our communities. And then the ecology, the industrial ag is destroying the earth. I mean, it's the leading driver of habitat loss, of water withdrawals. It's among the leading drivers of climate change, biodiversity loss. So we really need to look at this entire food system. And so to me, liberation on land would be to again, go back through all those points from sunshine to plate and say, well, what does it look like to truly have land reform, to rematriate the land to Indigenous people, to submit ourselves to Indigenous sovereignty and decision-making over how lands are used and shared in a way that centers women, trans and non-binary folks, youth and elders, the people whose voices have been excluded, right? When we think about labor, what are those pathways that exist from farm laborer to manager to owner? How do we support co-ops and food hubs? How do we equalize labor protections and make sure that farming is not just considered essential work, but those workers are also considered essential and their lives are considered essential? So there's legislative and policy change, there's cultural shifts. And this is an international issue. I mean, our country relies on creating conditions abroad that are so onerous for Indigenous people that they'll migrate from the territories that they own and the families they love to cross our hostile border into an uncertain future, often doing dangerous work that many Americans won't do for any amount of money. So, when we look at how do we infuse liberation on land into the consumer side of things, it means everybody has access to their cultural foods at prices they can afford in their neighborhoods. It means that we're using regenerative and ancestral practices to grow that food in a way that brings the pollinators back, in a way that sequesters carbon into the soil, out of the atmosphere and back into the soil where it belongs. It's recognizing the sovereignty of seed and the value of seed beyond commodity. It is protecting our waterways, it's protecting our airways. And this is not a small task, right? And in this moment, we're actually about to enter a very important holiday in the Jewish community called Tu B'Shvat. It is the birthday of trees. And so I'm thinking about Jewish teachings, and there's a powerful one in Pirkei Avot which says, you are not obligated to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. And so I think it is important to not get so overwhelmed that we think we can't do anything, and to remember that it's capitalism that wants us to measure success in quarterly returns, but it's the earth who wants us to measure our success in generational returns. And so we all need to do our part and then pass the baton to the next generation. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. And yeah, thinking in generational returns, that is a completely different way of thinking and a paradigm shift. So wonderful way to end there. Okay, and so Chris, I wanted to invite you to share your kind of, what does seeding liberation on the land look like for you?
Okay, yeah, well, following on from that, I mean, maybe the easiest thing is for me just to try and work my way through some of the stuff I say in my book, A Small Farm Future. And I think to get our heads around seeding liberation on the land, similar to what Leah was saying, I think, we need to look long into the past, but also long into the future. So I discuss fairly briefly in the book, sort of looking deeply into the long past. We've got to sort of think about the emergence of a capitalist world system over the last several hundred years, which has been very intimately bound up with colonialism, with racism, and with nationalisms of various kinds. And that process was such that many people were coerced off the land and stopped from working onto the land. Other people were coerced onto the land. So in different parts of the world, there's very sort of deep, complex histories of alienation or integration with the land that, that we have to address. But we've sort of got into this, a very common thing now is there's this kind of modernist progressive story that kind of says, yeah, whatever the wrongs of the past, we're now in this situation of industrialization and urbanization that kind of holds out the prospect for everybody to attain prosperity. And I don't think that story ever really was very believable. Maybe it was believable in the sort of post-war decolonization moment, but it's not really believable now. It's not believable for ecological reasons. It's not believable for economic or political reasons. So really we need to be thinking about new ways of working individually and together, lower carbon ways of working, more labor intensive, investing in low carbon and labor intensive job sectors, and farming, of course, is really critical in that. So for me, one aspect of seeding liberation on the land is people creating low impact livelihoods that involve fair access to local land. So obviously part of that is addressing that historical legacy, addressing inequalities of class, gender, ethnic and racial issues, and the kind of maldistribution globally as a result of those colonial processes. But to add on to that, if we think about the future, we're looking at a situation where there is increasingly and will be more large-scale climate forced migration, both within and between countries. I think we're looking at situations of de-urbanization as that kind of urban promise I was talking about fails. In many places, we'll be talking about more authoritarian forms of state control, but in other places, state decay and weakness, and sort of all sorts of economic and political crisis. So when you put all that together, it can be a pretty depressing picture, and I don't think we should shy away from that. But what I try and do in my book is accentuate the positive. I think it concentrates our mind on trying to create just and renewable local agrarian societies and livelihoods. So this to me is really a time for us to be experimenting with that. It's so important for us to be renewing our relationship with the land locally. But also we can learn from past agrarian societies and how they went about things. One aspect of that is low impact techniques. Pretty much every part of the world has got a kind of tradition of low impact, low energy, mixed labor intensive farming that we can learn from. But also in terms of social organization, and I talk a bit about that in my book, I think household farming, household-based farming is important because it's kind of self-limiting. You know, one of the problems with the capitalist system is about sort of creating, you know, it's a kind of process of endless growth, you know, creating greater return on investment. We've got to base our economies on our communities and our households. You know, what do we need to live well? You know, not creating more and more. So household basis of farming is something I talk about in the book, and that raises other problems that perhaps we can come on to. But also people working together, creating commons. And I think, you know, because so many of us are so alienated in a sort of contemporary capitalist society, you know, it's easy to latch on to commons. It's a bit of a sort of feel-good word, but so I think it's good to look at how agrarian societies have actually realized commons. And I talk in my book about what I call elemental commons. And what I mean by that is that most parts of the world, there are larger features of the local landscape that, you know, that you can't just manage as an individual or as an individual farm. So in some places that'll be something like fire risk. In other places it'll be water management, irrigation. In other places, earth kind of terraforming, you know, how we sort of create the earth, you know, and sort of terraform it to farm. So there's all these ways that people have creatively thought about coming together and managing the sort of the larger extensive features of the landscape, but also then sort of farming on a smaller scale in communities and in households. So I guess seeding liberation on the land for me is trying to hold all of those different strands together, creating a fair regime of commons management, but also household and individual property rights against this really challenging background of sort of historical injustice, but also the challenges that we're now facing: global crisis of climate, energy, the economy, and politics. So I sort of do my best in a sort of somewhat general way to raise those issues in the book. I mean, there isn't a magic bullet. You know, you can't write a book that kind of gives the answer to all that. There's no single solution. You know, the solutions are going to be very, very context dependent in terms of local histories and geographies. But it's something I think we're not, you know, in terms of sort of mainstream political and economic discussion, we're not really focusing on those issues because we're still buying into this kind of urbanization and economic growth narrative. So it's just so important, I think, for us to put that aside and get back into liberation on the land locally in terms of, you know, in terms of its histories and structures and geographies of the kind that I've been talking about.
Thank you, Chris. And yeah, I think, well, I have many questions later for you, but I think, you know, really investigating those local histories and geographies, it feels like there's something actually really exciting there that has been completely missed in our whole current narrative. And yeah, so I'm excited to dig into that. Okay, and finally, Vandana, please, if you could share, you know, what does seeding liberation on the land look like for you?
Well, seeding liberation on the land for me looks like Navdanya, the movement I started 33 years ago. And I started it because 36 years ago, farmers were protesting in Punjab like they're protesting on the streets of Delhi today for the liberation of the land. The farmers have been saying even now, and you know, the media covers other things, but the farmers say we are fighting for the soul and soil of our motherland. And 84, when Punjab erupted in violence, I decided to look into what was the slavery of the land, both the land itself and the farmers. Punjab farmers are very special, Northwest India, because they never allowed themselves to be dispossessed. I wouldn't go into the details of how they fought British imperialism, which was creating landlessness all over the world. And they fought for their land. And it's the Northwest India is a continuity of farmer cultivators, peasant cultivators, who never let their land be alienated from them. And as a result of which, I started to do ecological agriculture. I started to save seeds. And the Navdanya farm, where I'm spending, my lockdown time is now on the farm, and it's so beautiful that this land, which was a barren landscape, ruined by eucalyptus monoculture. Today, I don't know, we're growing about 2,000 varieties of crops. In addition to that, there must be about 200 medicinal plants that come up on their own. Edibles that we never planted, but are there because we don't spray Roundup, we don't spray weedicides. And the pollinators have gone up 6-fold. Our water levels have come up 70 meters just by taking care of the soil. And a recent study we did in our valley of 20 years of comparison between the chemical and the organic farms, the buildup on farms like ours of organic carbon is 99%, of nitrogen is 100%. And if they weren't back in the soil, they'd be in the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. But more importantly, the micronutrients, which the microbes create for us, the zincs, the irons, the magnesium, all of which are depleted, all of which are causing, even in rich countries, micronutrient deficiencies leading to depression, attention deficit disorder. They have increased in the organic farms and they've gone down in the chemical farms. So for me, seeding liberation looks like seeding liberation. Just take a seed, protect old seeds, conserve them, resist patenting, don't allow GMOs anywhere near you. And even the hidden GMOs, for sadly, Brexit is only about allowing GMOs. And now it is about the gene-edited GMOs promoted by Bill Gates, about which my book, Oneness versus 1%, is. Everything about gene editing is right there, including the 2 ladies who got the Nobel Prize this year. It's a 6, 7, 8 years experiment, proven to be a failure in terms of not being precise. So regenerating biodiversity in the soil, of the pollinators, of the insects, of the plants. And all we have to be is really in service of the earth. We just have to say thank you, Mother Earth, and give back a little of what organic matter she gave us. And then miracles come. All kinds of miracles, which are also lessons in how ecological systems work. I've learned all this by doing it. And I can tell you most textbooks, the old textbooks of the Green Revolution and industrial farming miss it, because soil is an empty container, plants are machines for fuel, that is nitrogen fertilizer. But even academic ecological textbooks miss the complexity and generosity with which we have to work to liberate the land. What the other part of seeding liberation on the land is knowing what not to do. We cannot allow a future which takes the next step after the Green Revolution and industrial farming, and is now digital agriculture. And again, I've written about that, farming without farmers. Now, if what liberating the land is about is care for the land, then you need people who care. And you remove people who care and think a few drones to spray more Roundup and a few satellites to take the photograph of a pest to have buyers sell you more pesticide. That cannot be the way to the future. That cannot be the liberation of the earth or of the people. We cannot allow the next step of being fooled, that our food will be farm free, a language that is being pushed like mad. No, food comes from the soil. Soil gives us food. And all the new initiatives, whether they be, high-rise agriculture, or they be lab-made impossible foods, it is all about a fear of working with the soil, realizing we are part of nature. And that's what created colonialism. That's what's created all the problems we have: ecological, agrarian, health, pandemics. And just going further, faster down that road cannot be a solution to an existential crisis we face. So I would basically say we have to liberate our mind from an industrial thinking, a mechanical thinking, assuming that productivity is only humans, minimized as labor inputs, and you can meantime pump more toxics, pump more fossil fuels, pump more capital, and dispossess everybody, which is why the land apartheid is there, which is why the food apartheid is there. We have to get rid of all apartheids, beginning with the ecological apartheid of the illusion that we are separate from nature. So it is a miraculous moment, because it's the ordinary people like my fellow farmers on the streets who are going to bring the change. Because on the top, there's an amazing coalition of the powerful to tell more lies, commit more violence, extract more money. They're in a very, very pathetic situation. And that's why they're afraid. They're afraid of people. And the reason they have to have such intense control systems is because of their fear of the land, of the farmer, of freedom.
Thank you. Powerful words as ever, Vandana. Thank you. And I really, so interesting that you said, it's their fear of working with the soil. Because, yeah, I mean, that really rings true. And there is a great complexity and generosity to soil that is very counter to the technological machine-like view of the world that you often refer to. So, yeah, I love that. So thank you, all three of you, for kind of laying out a vision for the future, and highlighting some of the issues that are kind of preventing liberation on the land, or that have come up in the past to mean that we are far from liberated on the land. And I guess where I wanted to start really is, I think all of you in some ways are sharing ideas that somewhat align with the worldview of Indigenous cultures. For me, it feels like many Indigenous cultures already embody the kind of the decolonized or pre-colonized vision of the world. And so one question I had, I guess, for all of you in this case is, do we need to get closer to Indigenous mindsets? Is that what we're kind of, is that the shift we're thinking about in order to see liberation? And if so, what does it mean to re-indigenize, thinking about local histories and cultures, for example, Chris, or what might it mean? Yeah. So Vandana, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, I think there's no escape, because colonization was both the extinction and erasure of the indigenous, in cultural terms, but in a genocidal terms too. All people before colonization were people of the land. And therefore their liberation as being human was so intimately connected to constantly liberating the land through sensitivity to how the land works. I mean, look at the fact that the oldest farming population on the planet is the Aboriginals of Australia. And they have farmed for 60,000 years in ways that they left no footprint, and the colonizers then created the story that they're Bushmen. But they are the greatest gardeners who didn't trample at all. And colonization and industrial agriculture has to ruin the land that it farms, and then move on and move on and move on. And therefore, why is GMO soya landing in the Amazon? Because it's such a wasteful way of producing food by not caring for the land. I've called it violence and war against the earth and farmers. So to be indigenous means to be at peace with the land and place where you are, and be deeply conscious of treading as lightly as possible. And like India, our prayer is you put your foot down in the morning and the first thing you say is, I'm so sorry, Mother Earth, I'm trampling on you, but I'll tread lightly. That constant consciousness of being part of the earth, but treading lightly, and therefore also being conscious that the earth's gifts are there for everyone to share, what Chris talked about, the commons. And I think the recovery of the commons, which was the colonization within England, the reversal of colonialism, which is decolonization, and the ecological apartheid of separation with nature, these three go hand in hand, and you have to become indigenous.
I like it. Yeah, go, Leah.
Well, building off of what you said, which was so beautiful, I just want to share a story about what re-indigenizing has meant in my own life, because those of us, regardless of our ethnic and cultural heritage, can be colonized internally, can behave in colonized ways externally, often unawarely, because we've been raised in this Western, white supremacist, heteronormative, etc. society. So when I was in my early 20s, I did what a lot of African Americans yearn to do, which is to trace the routes of my ancestors back, through the rural South, across the Atlantic, to West Africa. And in this case, my ancestors come from the Dahomey region, specifically the Krobo people. And I lived in Ghana for 6 months, and I studied with these elder women called the Queen Mothers, and they are just incredible. I mean, they raise the orphans, they mediate conflicts, they keep the stories and history of the community alive, facilitate rituals, protect the sacred groves, which in turn, protects the watershed, and are the custodians of the ethical and moral life of the community. So in spending time with them, one of the favorite games that they would play with me is when I would come into the compound where we would do soap making and batik as the income generating project to support the care of the orphans. They would ask me quiz questions about life in the United States, because we're real strange to them. And one of the days they said, is it true, Amida Day, is it true that in the US, a farmer would put a seed into the soil and they don't pray, they don't sing, they don't dance, they don't pour libation or make any offerings, they don't even say thank you to the ground. And then they expect the seed to grow and nourish them? And so I said ashamedly, like, yes, that is the case. Even me, who'd been farming at that point for, 5 years, which is a long time for a 20-year-old. They said, well, that's clearly why you're sick, right? You're sick because you treat the earth as a commodity and not as a relative. You treat the earth as a commodity and not as a relative. And even looking at our language, our environment, natural resources, this apartheid that Vandana is talking about, of separation between humans and the rest of nature, of dominion, of othering, of extraction, is really at the root of that. And I am wary sometimes of using words like indigenize or decolonize really broadly, because for my Turtle Island Indigenous comrades, I know that sometimes can feel as a dilution of the very real and tangible struggles of particular nations for particular sovereignty. But I will say, because I understand the spirit of the question, that one of the ways that I've bumped up against this recently, as I've tried to embody the spirit of my own Indigenous ancestors of West Africa, was saying, okay, well, this land we have here, it's 80 acres of land. We don't want to do private property anymore, right? So we're going to try to figure out a legal structure within white man's law where we can collectively hold this land, where we can afford rights to the Mohican Nation, who are the original inhabitants of the land, and where we can also afford rights of nature. Sounds simple enough. Even with looking at legal precedent from the Ojibwe people, from New Zealand, having amazing pro bono lawyers who contorted and twisted as much as they could, this idea of rights of nature as in a voting body, in a co-op, just right now we're in a battle with the Attorney General's office of New York State to get some final paperwork passed. It's been years now, so that we have our voting process for nature approved, right? And I wouldn't have known how difficult it was and how baked into our property laws and the assumptions of society it is that nature doesn't exist as a sovereign entity until actually trying to create that, right? Similarly, with the cultural respect easement for the Mohican Nation, ours is the first in New York State. It's only California and Massachusetts that have figured out how to get their heads around the idea that there could be a shared sovereignty on land, that somebody could have the deed and the deed could be modified so that other people for all generations could use the land for certain purposes. It's inconceivable, right? So I think that we do need to make that shift, and then we need to investigate and probe all the ways that we have a structural bias built into our systems that prevents us from implementing that fundamental shift.
Chris, do you have, yeah, go.
Oh yeah, I mean, somewhat along the lines of what Vandana was saying, you know, I think one of the issues is that we have this very sort of top-down narrative of agricultural improvement, and really the people that are thinking, you know, the people that know what they're doing are the farmers, and you know, farmers are always innovative, you know, they're always thinking of new ideas, but they're doing that within a context that's meaningful within their community. So, you know, one aspect of indigenizing for me is not this kind of top-down narrative of agricultural improvement that, you know, we've seen in, you know, all over the world. So, you know, certainly here in England, there's always been this sort of discourse of getting small farmers off the land and you know, improving it along the sort of industrial processes that Vandana was talking about. So I think it's, you know, indigenous farming to me is sort of, you know, reconnecting with the tradition of farmers themselves, knowing what's best for them and their communities. I mean, thinking about this question, I think the word indigenous just means such different things in different places. And here in England, if people talk about indigenous people, it's kind of a coded word for me, for white, basically. And I think there's a real problem, I think, with the kind of, you know, in other places it means something very different. But I guess one part of the argument in my book is to be careful about the kind of here first argument, you know, that the kind of forces that are at play in the world are just bringing people from, you know, into new relationships with each other in so many different ways that a kind of here first argument, not always, but you know, certainly in a British context, I don't think makes sense. But where I think we can talk about indigenous agriculture is the fact that a country like Britain, I mean, human labour is costly and energy is cheap. So the way that agriculture works in Britain is that we have a very mechanised agriculture, and anything that's labour intensive, we kind of export the responsibility to, you know, we either import migrant labour, you know, under sort of poor labour terms, or we export the responsibility to produce food to places in the world where labour is cheaper. And I think, you know, basically that's not okay, you know. So for me, sort of an indigenous agriculture means you know, taking responsibility for our own livelihoods and feeding ourselves. And, you know, often in Britain, you get people saying, well, it's such a densely populated country and, you know, we haven't been food self-sufficient for hundreds of years. But I show in my book that we could very easily be food self-sufficient, not only for the existing population of Britain, but for a larger population if we have climate refugees coming here. You know, the problem is not that we can't do it, it's that we haven't done it. It hasn't been a policy priority. So in a sense, for me, sort of re-indigenizing is about taking that responsibility to produce food, which we can do in low impact ways. I mean, I suppose I was at the Oxford Real Farming Conference with Guy Shrubsole, who's written an amazing book, Who Owns England? And, you know, like many parts of the world, we have a very unequal distribution of land ownership in Britain. And there's one aspect of that is, you know, the aristocracy that still owns large amounts of land. And over the last couple of hundred years, that hasn't necessarily been important in terms of political or economic power, because it's, you know, we've gone down this kind of industrial urbanization route. But I think access to land is going to assume political importance in the future. So that's, you know, a huge discussion we have to have about land reform and land ownership. I mean, one thing I've noticed a little bit in terms of indigeneity is people sort of, you know, I think people tend to reach back for a sense of historical purity. So in England, people often talk about the Norman conquest, you know, the Normans came and took the land, and we need to sort of get back to this kind of pre-Norman Anglo-Saxon land to the people. And there's always a bit of mythologizing going on there, because, you know, you have to go an awful long way back in English history to get to a point where you know, there wasn't a kind of hierarchy and inequalities in access to the land. So, you know, I think there's, as I was saying in my opening remarks, you know, we do need to embrace the historical knowledge of land and land ownership, but really these kind of, you know, the urge to hierarchy, the urge to status and to unequal access is a sort of ever-present struggle through history. So, you know, it's not about returning to a, you know, to a pure historical state. It's about, you know, constantly keeping in mind the need to keep access to land available to everybody. And of course, part of that in a country like Britain is not expecting other countries in the world to feed us. You know, we need to take responsibility for our livelihood.
Vandana and Leah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, because obviously Chris was bringing up, you know, land reform and land ownership. You know, these are so central, as you both outlined, to kind of this seeding liberation on the land. And I think, you know, they're incredibly complicated questions, but I would love to hear from both of you, you know, if you were to invent, like, what might it actually look like? You know, we heard words like commons, and Leah, you talked about, you know, not having private ownership of your particular 80 acres. What might that transition look like in both of your minds? Yeah, I'd love to hear, because it seems like a huge elephant in the room, and it's not always clear what the pathway might be.
Abby, I think because the world is so pluralistic and so diverse, in some places it means just defending the rights of the people where they are, because those rights are being deprived. I mean, I worked with my government in the past to write forest rights law that, you know, tribal people are the first people, and their rights cannot be alienated for development projects. We wrote a law that they would decide what's development. And in the first 2 years, they shut down steel plants and coal mines and bauxite mines. And then, of course, the alienation started. But the farmers are fighting today against laws that they know will dispossess them of the land. Yeah, will turn them landless. So there's where the land is in the hands of small farmers and indigenous people, we need to defend that. And I think what's shared amongst all of us is the experience of farming that shows that small farms are more productive. And in fact, if we have more small farms in the world, we will have more food. Our work in Navdanya on health per acre shows that if you measure in terms of nutrition, it's only small farms that can maximize nutrition. The large farms produce more nutritional empty commodities, which don't go to feed anybody, just biofuel and animal feed. So where the land has been appropriated, of course we need, I mean, after all, what was the enclosure of the commons? Taking peasant land away. And we need a reclaiming of the commons, of the seed, of knowledge, of water, also of the land. And there, the way it would be is amazing. You know, one of Gandhi's associates, Vinoba, started a Bhudan movement, the gift of land, trusteeship, that land, not as property, but you hold it in trust. And we need to start innovating with that. And finally, to me, the biggest concern, and it's the subject of my book, is you've got to stop the Bill Gates who pretend to digitalize agriculture and are becoming the biggest land grabbers of the world today. You know, he talks about digitalizing seed and dematerializing economy and dematerializing our lives. And meantime, he's grabbing everything material that sustains our lives. If anyone interested in the future of food and the seeding liberation is not watching this man and his fellow billionaires, then, we are not prepared enough for the new threats. You see, we're dealing with the old colonization, the historic colonization, but we've got to already look at the present and future colonization in order to liberate the land and the people of the land.
I mean, it's pretty much all been said, but of course, it is crucial to liberate the land in the sense of shared sovereignty and in the sense of rights of nature. And I mentioned in my opening remarks how in the United States, 98% of the arable land by value and 95% by acres is owned by one racial group in a very pluralistic society, which is a tragedy. And there are a number of tools that we have available to help us push back against that, but we don't have a comprehensive strategy. So one of those tools is, of course, the land trust. And the model of the community land trust was developed by Black farmers in the 1960s. The first one was the New Communities Land Trust. Charles and Shirley Sherrod, 500 Black families working together. They had been kicked off of their respective lands as sharecroppers because of the audacity of trying to register to vote or join the NAACP. And so they banded together and they got 5,700 acres in Albany, Georgia. And this is an incredible feat because together they had created a model of cooperative stewardship, of making sure that the land was protected in perpetuity, and being able to have cooperative economics. And this builds on a legacy of cooperation in the Black community. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in the early 1900s about farmer-producer co-ops. If you go back to the motherland, of course, you have the Susu and the Dokpwe. The Susu is a proto-credit union. The Dokpwe is a system of sharing labor without wages through exchange, through very careful and codified exchange. And so these elements of cooperation, I think, are certainly part of it. At the national level, we can look at that in terms of utilizing the national trust. But taking land off of the speculative market and valuing it outside of capitalism is going to be fundamental to those solutions.
Great, yeah. I think following on from, obviously, Vandana, you've been brought up Bill Gates a few times in your book, and I've seen you speak about this kind of the new colonialists or the new colonialism that's really coming our way. And I wondered if, I don't know, maybe all three of you have heard of this UN Food Summit that's coming up later this year. And I think it's funded partially by the Gates Foundation, the Syngenta Foundation, and a few others. And it's really being pinned as the future of food. How are we going to feed the world? And their agenda is very much focused on big data, technology, and this digital farming future that you keep referring to, Vandana, or that's my understanding of it. And I wanted to know, how can we, in the face of these like huge corporate efforts that seem to be pushing this other narrative, how do you respond to that? And how are you responding to the Future Food Summit, the UN Food Summit, Vandana? And
so I'll go back to how I responded to the Syngentas and the Ciba-Geigys and the poison cartel, I call them, in '87, talking about owning life through GMOs and patents, and having an international trade system, the WTO and GATT, to create laws of owning seeds, the intellectual property laws. So at that point, I said, I'm going to save seeds, but I'll also work to make sure that the laws don't internalize this lie of seed as an invention. Now we're at that kind of moment now about everything, about food, about land, about democracy, about freedom. And, the food summits have always been in Rome, which is where the Food and Agriculture Organization is. It was taken literally to New York. And the person who's heading it is the person who heads Bill Gates' program, AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, while the farmers of India are protesting against all the problems that that model has created. So how do we face this? The first thing is civil society is basically, as good as said, this is so wrong. How can a UN system be privatized, which is B? I think we need much more awareness of, just like we were told, without chemicals, we will starve. And, you know, when the poison cartel and IG Farben created the entire nitrogen fixing of, by burning fossil fuels at high temperature, and they made explosives, but then they also made the synthetic fertilizer. And I think Bosch's word was, we'll make bread from air. We won't need soil, we won't need land. And of course, we know what the nitrogen fertilizers have given us: greenhouse gases, dead oceans, dead soils, and nitrate, poisoning of water. Now they're saying, well, without big data, you're going to starve. And digital is precise. No, it's not. You know, taking one element of a complex farming system and having a camera to document it, to then feed into the poison cartel, to sell more chemicals, is not precision. It is colonization continued. But now with a new convergence, you see, earlier it was just the poison cartel. Or earlier it was just the colonizer, then it was the colonizer plus poison cartel. Now it's the digital giants, it's the big tech, it's the poison cartel, it's surveillance capitalism, data mining from farmers to sell them back big data. I was just being told today by someone who works in oil, who came to learn organic farming from us. He said the big oil company in India is phasing out of oil because big data is the new oil, and he wants more money in big data. So what is big data? Big data is lots and lots and lots of extracted information, not knowing how the whole holds together. And then just putting it together as another narrative of power. So how we deal with it is keep that true knowledge alive by the doing of ecological agriculture. And I think dialogues like today are important because, you know, India can be made into a special problem, and then you can create a ruckus at the Red Fort. Black Lives Matter can be made special to America. Brexit, of course, is its old place, and your prime minister will apologize for the deaths. I don't know if he'll apologize for the deaths because of creating a junk food nation of the highest order. I think realizing that we have diversity in the world, we have diversities of histories, but all our histories are connected in the past through the empire of cotton, and now through the empire of Gates. And they work very much on the same patterns, but we became liberated through liberation movements of the past. And the new liberation movements of our times have to be the joint liberation of nature with rights of Mother Earth and people in all their diversity. And we just have to do it, you know. Now it's not a luxury. Now it is an imperative. It's basically a survival imperative now, but we got to have joy doing it. We got to have fun doing it. And we got to make lots of friends doing it, including all the other beings who are our most important friends. You know, in India, we have a lovely vocabulary for this because we never objectified our relatives. So Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is the earth family. Vasundhara is the earth. Kutum is our family. The trees, the plants, the microbes, the birds, everything is this family. They're all unique unto themselves, but not unequal. And being diverse doesn't mean inequality. And that's the problem of colonialism. It treated diversity as a reason to create hierarchies. And we have to treat diversity as both the strength of nature as well as our strength.
Yeah. I feel like your words are fueling me in the face of, you know, things like the UN Food Summit. I think, you know, the more we can connect with the work, like all three of you are working in farming as well, and you're doing the doing. And the more we can all come together around that, it does feel like that's where the energy is. And that is the synchronicity across continents as such. And And I wanted to hear Chris and Leah, like, do you see, we could see this, because we're talking about quite radically different visions to the status quo of today, as you kind of all outline in your individual ways. Do you see this as a revolution, or is it more of a renaissance? Is this something that can be achieved through kind of a gradual dawning of a new narrative for people, through joy and through fun? Like, is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to work on lots of different fronts. I mean, I think like many people, I find the sort of political lobbying of the centre is kind of just a bit too depressing for me. I'm grateful for the people that do it, but there's a lot of people working at that sort of bottom up change, and it was really interesting hearing Leah talking about the origins of community land trusts. Because it is sort of indigenous or minority communities that that have to actually work together and create kind of capitalize themselves, and I think we can learn from that. And certainly, I mean, I'm involved here in the UK in a organisation, the Ecological Land Co-op, and other ventures where it's kind of about bottom up accessing the land, and it's kind of difficult because so much money ends up in the pocket of landowners. There's a kind of systemic issue there that's difficult to deal with, but it's, I think, I suppose in my book, I mean, I basically I'm arguing for a lot of people to be on the land, not necessarily as full-time commercial farmers, but we just need to completely rethink the labor dynamics of producing from the land. And people say, well, that's unrealistic, and so you get the sort of Bill Gates narrative. And I mean, I think and that's really important to contest at a number of different levels. I mean, one thing that encourages me is there's so many more young people now than there were sort of 20 odd years ago who are switched into the issues of social justice and environmental issues and are getting interested in farming, and it never really used to be, if you weren't sort of born into farming in a country like Britain, it never was, it wasn't really something people sort of thought about as a career. But people are switching into it, and one reason for that, I think, is because of the crisis in the mainstream economy. The kind of jobs that were available 20 or 30 years ago, were more attractive than farming. But there is a kind of intrinsic labor crisis to the capitalist global economy that we are increasingly hitting, where it's becoming more and more oppressive to more and more people. It's not offering that kind of liberation that its proponents, that I was speaking about earlier, have offered. So that, that's a source for hope, that I think it's so many more people and so many more young people are thinking more creatively about, what they actually want. What do we want the economy to do? It's, it's about people, and it's and therefore it's about our well-being on the land. So that's a kind of a source of encouragement. But I mean, I think the other thing about the mainstream food narrative is that it's based on these really kind of improbable notions of energy futures. I mean, there's this sort of very, very tight relationship between economic growth, greenhouse gas emissions, and fossil fuel use. And obviously there's, I mean, I show some figures in my book, there's there's the sort of notion of decoupling or of transitioning out of fossil fuels into low carbon forms of energy, so that we can keep the whole, the old jalopy on the road indefinitely. But the more you look at it, it's just not feasible. We are not transitioning out of, it's basically fossil energy is the thing that's keeping this whole really sort of rackety, inequitable global system on the road. And I don't really think that sort of top-down mainstream food narrative, this sort of industrial food narrative, it's going to hit the buffers of through its own logic. And so that's why it's really important. I mean, is potentially scary because, as Vandana was saying, you know, like junk food nation like the UK, very, very urbanized nation, you know, we are reliant on that system. So we've got to, you know, we've got to reduce our reliance. So that's where I think the sort of bottom-up activism and the debate about access to land and people figuring, you know, people pooling their resources and figuring out ways of accessing that. I mean, you know, it feels like a long trek at the minute, but you know, I think the pace of it is picking up, and you know, so much more, so many more people involved and doing things at so many more levels than they were even a few years ago. So you know, there is, I think, potential there for a renaissance, I hope.
Yeah, and Leah, I think one thing I always really appreciate about your communications is that you do bring joy and beauty to the forefront, whilst also, you know, you're never hiding anything, but you're able to communicate in a way that feels high integrity, but not threatening. It doesn't feel like you're making people wrong. And I wonder, is that an active decision? Like, you know, if you're going to seed liberation on the land through a renaissance, do you need to be inviting people in as opposed to shutting them out, or, you know, threatening them? What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting dichotomy that you propose. I'm not sure I think that like revolution and joy are not synonymous, or what we might consider the brutal truth or firm accountability is somehow different than kindness and inclusion. You know, I think one of the challenges sometimes when we frame it that way is that I've experienced a yearning amongst people who are actively benefiting from white supremacy, from colonization, from corporate greed. This yearning to be exempt, to be comfortable, to be coddled to, right? To be not held accountable, to have these histories that have led up to the current gross inequalities ignored, and let's just pretend that all didn't happen and start from today, right? And the fact of the matter is, you know, in our country alone, and I'm sure it's worse disparities if you take global statistics, but a white child born in America today will be 16 times wealthier when they take their first breath than a Black child born in America today. And it's not because the white child did financial literacy in the womb, right? It's because of inherited wealth. And that wealth is almost universally traceable to something stolen, whether that is land, labor, right? Resources stolen from other people on the earth. And so we can't pretend that that isn't the reality, and that if we start just being nice and joyful, that it will fix the problem. I think whether we call it revolution or whether we call it renaissance, you know, it's, to me, the land needs to be shared. The capital needs to be shared. The workers' rights need to be protected. It's these fundamental structural pieces that need to shift. Can we shift them through policy, which might happen because there's a cultural revelation? Yes, maybe. But historically speaking, that's actually rare, if ever, in the historical record that we've been able to simply rely on essentially those in power to be enlightened to give up their resources. You know, power doesn't concede without a demand. Doesn't mean it has to be violent struggle, but there is discomfort. There is opposition, right? There is people chaining themselves to things. And that historically has been part of making fundamental structural change. And so I can't imagine how we would get the kind of just world that we need without using all of the tactics that we have at hand.
Yeah, totally acknowledged. And yeah, I think yeah, I'm feeling like the discomfort and just embracing the discomfort and feeling that is part of our future, and that feels like, you know, that's part of sort of acknowledging also the destruction to the earth. You know, it's like we can all see and feel that discomfort of the earth around us, and it's sort of like really engaging with that is where it seems to you start to connect with, you know, what has gone before and just how unjust it all has been, and maybe that's part of how we move to the future. Yeah, so I think I like that. Good word, discomfort. So, okay. I wanted, well, I always like to ask, I don't know if you guys had any questions for each other in particular that you've been yearning to ask one another, but maybe just keep that in mind. I won't force you to do that right now, but I'll invite you to do that in a few minutes or so. So if there is something you wanted to ask, please do think about that. And then I guess my question right now is, you know, if we just think on the individual level, so, you know, all the different people watching are probably asking themselves, oh, you know, well, where do I fit in this? Maybe not everyone has access to land, or, you know, maybe they didn't even realize land was important until we just had these discussions. So what can individuals do going forward to be part of all of this and to be part of seeding liberation on the land? And one question in particular, I guess, for, you know, Chris, you certainly addressed this. It's like, does everyone need to think of themselves as a farmer to get this future that we want? You know, maybe they're not farming 24/7, but is that kind of part of the transition and the transformation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, everyone does need to think of themselves as a farmer, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be a farmer in the, you know, in the sort of traditional image that we have of it. I mean, I think I'm not sure if it made it into the final version of my book, but I had a section called "We Are All Farmers," and it kind of, as a bit like I was saying earlier, I think we have to take responsibility for livelihood and for food production. So, you know, part of this, I think, is breaking down the distinction between professional commercial farmers and amateur growers. You know, there's a whole spectrum. I mean, I call, you know, and if you're living on, you know, in a high-rise city block and you've got you know, a pot on your windowsill with some herbs in it, as far as I'm concerned, you're a farmer. You know, there's and then, you know, through the whole spectrum to somebody sitting in a big tractor somewhere. You know, I really think we've got to break that down, and all, you know, across that spectrum, people at some level are taking responsibility or need to be empowered to take the responsibility for the food system. But also, you know, I guess, so yeah, I mean, a big part of what I'm trying to argue is more about not necessarily individual self-reliance, but community, local self-reliance. You know, we need to relocalize farming, so that does mean that people who aren't farming, you know, need to sort of not take food for granted. Well, you know, who is producing my food, and you know, under what circumstances are they doing that? So then the other part of that is a sort of notion of right livelihood, I would say. I mean, and I talk about it quite a bit in the book, but, you know, there's a kind of mythology of the capitalist market dynamics that, you know, it's a sort of Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market, where it kind of produces everything that people need, and for, you know, for all sorts of reasons that I'm, you know, don't need to go into now, and I'm sure everyone's very familiar with. You know, that's not really how the market works. So, you know, if you're not producing food, you know, if you're not literally a farmer, then you need to be thinking about the right livelihood. You know, the people that are producing your material livelihood, you know, we need to take responsibility for them, and to ensure that you know, that they are able to create a livelihood. So, you know, I think, you know, the language is important in some ways, saying, you know, yes, I am a farmer, or, you know, yes, I, you know, in some ways, these sort of crazy high-tech things that Vandana was talking about. I mean, I think her point about fear of the soil is absolutely spot on. You know, that we sort of invent all these ways of trying to distance ourselves from the productivity of the land where we are, and that is not going to you know, literally bear fruit in the long run. So yeah, we are all farmers, and we have to individually, I guess, interpret what that means in our lives and in our relationships with other people.
Vandana, what are your thoughts on that in terms of, I mean, do you think it would all change if Bill Gates became a farmer, if he did?
Yeah. I think he needs a gardening lesson, yeah, and true gardening with humility. You know, for one, he'd realize that finding new ways to make money, including philanthrocapitalism, isn't the true economy. The true economy is of the land. And the further, if colonialism created the rupture, then every step of new colonization is not just distancing ourselves from the land physically, but from the laws of the land. And I think that's the key. To be a farmer is to live according to the laws of the land. And part of what, I noticed that in the chat, there was a question, this assumption that we have to have farm-free food because there's scarcity of land. There's no scarcity of land. There's scarcity of care for the land. And that is why there's so much abandoned land. There's so much desertified land. And we need care for the land because the only way to get food. So, what I have learned since 84, when I studied the Green Revolution, is you hide the negative economy, the entropy creating system of 10 units of input of energy to produce 1 unit of bad food that makes you sick. And every time you intensify the energy input, you are creating more entropy. So I have asked people again and again and again who want to farm without soil and without sun. And I said, give me your energy equation. How much energy do you use? And what's the energy in the food you produce? Because it is absolutely nutritionally empty. And again, we have 3 beautiful words in our language. We don't talk of energy in one way. There's energy that actually generates energy. That's sattvic. There's energy that gets you excited for a short time, and that's rajasic. And then there's a heavy energy that dissipates and depletes, which is tamasic. Now, the production system is tamasic, but the food we are eating is tamasic. And we need to move to sattvic, which means it has to be true to the laws of the land. We are producing and eating food-looking stuff. It's not food. Because food is taking the gifts of the soil fully and letting that circulate through your body. And the minute you've interrupted that flow, I've always said food is the currency of life. When you've interrupted it anywhere, just like people have heart problems when their arteries get blocked, we are blocking the arteries of the food circulation. And you'll get climate change, you'll get species extinction, you'll get chronic diseases, you'll get diabetes. You are going to get, you're going to get all the problems. And hiding that blocking of circulation does not get you anywhere. So we have to be farmers. I totally support Chris. We all have to be farmers through caring for the land. You might be one step removed, but then, as he said, you've got to have responsibility for the earth as well as the farmer and eat with consciousness. So for those who are worried, but what can I do? Well, you eat, don't you? And you want to be healthy, don't you? From there, everything else starts to fall in place. From beginning with, we live on food. All beings live on food. And because we've been so industrialized and are thinking that food is a manufacture, no, food is the currency of life. And you've got through care to make it pure, more truthful, more honest.
Yeah, I always remember I saw you speak not that a few years ago, and food is the currency of life. That it rings like through my head again and again because it is such a powerful statement. And just, yeah, I really love that statement. And Leah, yeah, go.
I mean, I just have the shortest thing to add to this overarching question of do we all need to be farmers, however we define that. And there's a beautiful, powerful, and probably uncomfortable quote from Wenzel Berry that I want to read that I think addresses the deeper why of all of us touching the earth. So it goes like this. The white man, preoccupied with the abstractions of the economic exploitation and ownership of the land, necessarily has lived on the country as a destructive force, an ecological catastrophe, because he assigned the hand labor, and in that the possibility of intimate knowledge of the land to a people he considered racially inferior. In thus debasing labor, he destroyed the possibility of meaningful contact with the earth. He was literally blinded by his presuppositions and prejudices. Because he did not know the land, it was inevitable that he would squander its natural bounty, deplete its richness, corrupt and pollute it, or destroy it altogether. The history of the white man's use of the earth in America is a scandal.
Wow. Yeah. Well put by, yeah. Always, Wendell Berry always seems to get to the crux of the matter so eloquently as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I just, coming back to that, Leah, in your experience of the youth program, you know, seeding or liberation on the land, what is the appetite? I mean, obviously that's a specific group of young people who are already engaged somewhat in food, I would assume in some way often, but, you know, if you were to say to them all like, okay, you know, we're all going to be farmers from now on, like, what is the appetite there? Is that one of like, oh, no, thank you, or, you know, where are they at? And
oh, it's such a lovely question. So it is true that the Liberation on Land week-long camp is selective, so these youth are different. But we do youth programs for approximately 500 to 1,000 youth per year who are coming with their school groups, they're coming with after-school programs, churches, and so forth. And the skepticism about farming is real, right? Remember that the land was the scene of the crime, especially for Black and brown people in the United States. So immediately you start to hear young people say, oh, are you all slaves? You picking cotton? You know, stooping, getting dirty, that's not for me. So there is a generational trauma there. At the same time, almost universally, after spending a day on the farm or more with people who look like them, who have common experiences, common cultural reference points, seeing people, oh, you built your house? You like the same music as me? You grow your food? You can eat that, right? You own your business? You work for yourself? You start to see this softening, this opening, this sense of possibility. And for us, it's not so much that every child becomes a farmer per se, at least in the narrow definition, but can they see their inherent value? Can they see that they belong, that they have a future beyond incarceration or consumerism, that they can make their dreams come true? And of course, we want them to respect the earth, and I think that goes along with it, but people need to have dignity to start thinking about things like, how do I respect the earth? The Liberation on Land group in particular, you know, it is an application to get into the special camp. And something that was powerful for me is we had this tacit assumption as the adults that this would be a one-year program. It was sort of created as a rites of passage. And then we get a new cohort. And at the end of this session, the children said to us that they were not leaving and that they would be back next year and the year after and the year after that. So we've had the same kids in this program, which gives you a sense. And, you know, I don't know how many will be commercial farmers. And I think it's in some ways unfair to put on them because it's nearly, it's really not viable to be a small scale regenerative farmer and make a dignified living the way that our economy is set up. And there's a lot of complexity to that. But will they have a relationship with their ancestors, with the earth? Will they get excited when they see an owl fly across the window like I just did and land on a sunflower that they planted? Yes, they will. And it's up to us as the decision makers in society to make it possible for children to dream of being a farmer and knowing that they would have livelihood and dignity and autonomy in that role.
yeah, and yeah, I like the dream of being a farmer, and that is like something that people aspire to. Like that's such, it's just a completely different context, certainly than my upbringing. Anyway, so I wanted at this point to invite you, if you have any, I think Vandana, if maybe you mute yours. Oh, she's gone. Yeah, if you did have any questions for each other, I would love to give, you know, the opportunity to ask those. I don't know if either of you, oh yeah, Chris, go for it.
Well, yeah, I had a question for Leah, actually. I was reading your book, which is, yeah, really amazing. But one thing that interested me, I mean, you were talking earlier about sort of cooperative farming models and certainly sort of the sort of historical research I've done, you know, so many agrarian societies, you know, they put a real lot of effort into figuring out the minutiae of how they work together. And I sort of noticed that in your book, that you have to do quite a lot of work to figure out, you know, how to work with other people and how to, you know, how for it not to fall apart. And I mean, there's quite a few collective farming enterprises I know of that have sort of tend to fall apart, or, you know, often it's other things in the wider society that manifest in a human conflict on the farm, you know. So I sort of noticed that you've obviously put some thought into that. I just wondered if you could share any sort of lessons or learnings from that process.
Well, I'm feeling a little old because I'm already sort of a cynical nihilist around this stuff, because I have also seen a lot of things fall apart. And but I will say that a mentor of mine who I really respect, Dr. Gordon Nemhard, who's an academic and expert on co-ops, Black historian, you know, kind of helped me ease up a little bit on my discouragement, because she said, fundamentally, the issue is that we don't learn how to cooperate from the time when we're little. So as adults, when we've already internalized all of these values around individualism, around competition, around power grabbing, around vengeance, then we get together and try to like recreate these microcosms of the new society, and we don't have the skills. We don't know how to do nonviolent communication. We don't know about consensus process. We don't know about compromise. We don't know about empathy. We have no emotional intelligence, like very low emotional intelligence. So she was saying, fundamentally, like, take it easy on ourselves, but start to figure out how from preschool age are we integrating these lessons of cooperative governance, of transformative justice and conflict resolution into what we're teaching our children. And that's going to be part of the cultural shift. It's very difficult. All that to say, we do our best. You know, we certainly have very transparent governance. We have processes in place for face-to-face feedback. We have conflict negotiation protocols. We have external support, you know, work tasks and lists and check-ins. So we certainly do our best. And I will say, though, especially with the stressors of 2020, with multiple pandemics, when people get scared, when they get stretched, we'll often fall back on the patterns of their, you know, of their upbringing. And so I'm noticing that is possibly the biggest need that we have to be successful in really creating this new society, is figuring out cooperative governance and transformative justice.
Yeah, great question. And definitely a struggle for all of us, I think. I'm going to now just ask some questions from the chat. So, and I'm not sure where Vandana is, but hopefully she'll return at some point. I know it's very late for her there, after midnight, so I'm not sure if that's why. But
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Oh, I just can't see you.
My iPad battery died, so I had to change.
Okay. Oh, welcome back.
And, and a number, so you wouldn't have recognized me initially. Yeah.
Well, Vandana, did you have any questions you wanted to ask, or are you happy for me to move on to questions from the
move on. I'd like to get to bed. Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is something that really interests me as well. It's a question from Annabelle Lind. And she asked, do you personally shift your language around nature in order to account for the soul within living ecosystems? So she says, Robin Wall Kimmerer's pronouns for plants as kith and kin come to mind. And I wonder if you also have language that encompasses this familial relationship with the land, countering commodification. Do any of you have a response to that? How you language your connection or relationship to the land and the language you choose to use? Are you careful?
Well, you know, let me come into this. So, you know, I live in a civilization that's an ecological civilization. And in our languages, that's how we talk about our seeds and our plants. And the beauty is, no one will do a ceremony with a crossbred cow. Nobody will use a hybrid seed for a ceremony. Yeah. So even though at the propaganda level, all this productivity, efficiency, is adopted, at the cultural level, it is still the integrity of other beings that carries the relationship. So when I work with community, I learn from them because, you know, my whole life went in quantum theory and my life went in physics. So everything I've learned about these relations is really from our communities. But of course, when, you know, to you, I'll say food is the currency of life. But to a Bill Gates, I will explain why the nutrition cycle is being disrupted by his madness. So of course you have to, you know, the different communities use different languages, and you know, that's the beauty of our world. We have so many languages, and then I think it would be stupid for people to mechanically take someone else's language and try and fit into your. We have to evolve into the cosmology that makes us realize that we are one Earth family.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know, Chris or Leah, if you have any thoughts on language in particular, but it's almost, Vandana, what I got from what you're saying is it's almost like we have to embrace the diversity of language as well. And that is part of the diversity, and that's part of the oneness, the all. I think that, yeah, that resonates. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. So this is, Zoe asks, as a young white woman with a passport from the United States, how should or can I best use my voice and privilege to help reshape the food system to something more social, economically, and environmentally just? Still trying to find my place in this movement.
I can speak to that and say we certainly all have a place. There's a beautiful image of the butterfly of transformative social justice. It has 4 winglets, and one of the wings is resist. It has to do with the ways that we go up and confront oppression very directly, the boycotts, the blockades, the protests. Another one of those wings is reform. It has to do with policy change, elected office, institutional transformation. Another wing is build, and it has to do with creating alternative institutions like land trust, freedom, schools, and farms. And the 4th wing is heal, how we heal from trauma, conflict, circles, revitalization of indigenous foodways, spiritual practice, therapy. And we actually need all. A butterfly cannot fly without all 4. So yes, we all have a place. How do we find our place? I think whenever we're working on a particular issue, it is important to listen to and heed the voices of those most impacted by the issue. So if we're talking about racial injustice in the food system, it means Black and brown folks who are farmers, food workers, consumers in the food system. If you go to our website, soulfirefarm.org, under Take Action, there are over 100 things you can do and ways to get involved in trying to heal and repair this really troubled food system. So definitely check that out. If you've not already done self-education as far as taking uprooting racism trainings, you know, some of the programs that are offered through Via Campesina, for example, to understand food sovereignty, do that, because it always helps when you are showing up to try to be supportive to a movement, to have done your homework and to be versed in the norms, the vocabulary, the goals of that movement. And then the last thing I would say is, you know, whenever we are newer to something, being willing not to steer, but being willing to be in a support role. So a lot of times you might be starting out by doing childcare and making coffee and like running copies for a Black or brown led organization while sort of build trust and find your place. But really being willing, again, to let frontlines communities take the lead. You know, Indigenous peoples across the world have always known what they and we have needed and how to get there. And so listening, cultivating that art of listening is going to be an important step.
I mean, I suppose the only thing, you know, there's so many ways of answering that question, but I think, yeah, it was interesting, like Vandana talking about the Green Revolution earlier, and I think, you know, there are so many different narratives in different parts of the world, and I mean, you know, Vandana's work has been incredibly informative in terms of the problems of the Green Revolution. And I was talking to an Indian friend today who was saying, you know, in India, the whole notion of the the public perception of it is as a really problematic thing. Whereas, I spend quite a lot of my time interacting with, people in Britain or in the States where, Norman Borlaug is a hero, and the Green Revolution was this, hugely successful achievement in feeding the world and so on. So I kind of think, maybe it's just another way of adding to what's already been said, but sort of being aware of those other narratives, and being aware that there's a lot of power in North America and in Western Europe that's kind of sort of imposed its narrative on other parts of the world, which is, and there are other narratives, and I think we need to hear those narratives. And again, that's part of the whole food sovereignty, the idea, the idea of taking local responsibility for food, I think, rather than these, very top-down feeding the world narratives that we were talking about earlier.
And here's another question, also kind of expanding on what we've talked about already, really, is do any of you have any thoughts on how artists can help us all imagine our possible, beautiful, regenerative, collective future? What is the role of culture and arts in bringing this into being?
Let me tell you from my experience. One is, the beauty of care for the land and beauty of good farming is something that artists can communicate much better than any other group of people. The second is, I started to work on seeds because of the GMO patent question. And then the attacks came from the biotech industry, huge. I mean, quite amazing. I've experienced anything that can be done by the mafia that controls agriculture. And they started to control scientific debates, university talks, etc. But where were the biotechnology and GMO discussions taking place over the last decade? Among artists, in art festivals, in art museums. And this year, the land question has only been discussed by artists and museums again. Yeah. So artists have a very big role to play in this. And art is always a big role to play when there is rapid change. Slow, tedious change, you can keep working out the equations, but you want quick change of the imagination. It's different forms of art, the music, the painting, the film, that starts to have a big contribution.
Totally. And we were talking before, Leah, your sister, sharing at the Oxford Real Farming Conference, Naima, some of her poetry. It did, it felt like what I get from art is it communicates things in a way that just, it hits you completely differently. And it can really speak to the soul where other things can't. And the possibility of transformation by communicating at that level just feels like, yeah, and really impactful. I don't know, Leah, if you have an experience, are you sharing art also on the youth programs? Is that part of it?
So my wonderful sister Naima and I have divided up our skills in the world. So my art is planting things and sort of the choreography of the land. And Naima is a stunning visual artist, the painting inside Farming While Black of our ancestors braiding seeds in their hair before being forced on the transatlantic slave ships, tells that story in a way that is so irresistible, so compelling, so heart-centered. The poem, Black Gold, at the end of Farming While Black, she wrote by listening to me give speeches and lectures about the history of our relationship to soil, and then turned it into this like tantalizing, dripping with goodness, poetic flow. So yes, absolutely. I mean, the thing that's amazing about artists is they see what doesn't exist. And how can we create a world that doesn't exist without these visionaries who know how to conjure up what is beyond our collective imagination, right? So artists absolutely have a role to play.
And Chris, just speaking to the English the British or the UK context here, what do you think about, is there a lot of art and culture that's really envisioning the future that you're sharing, the small farm future? Or do you think that's missing?
I think it's missing, to be honest, but I mean, I agree with what Leah just said, is what, we need people to kind of, dream it into being, we need visionary artists. I mean, one thing I talk about a bit in the book, I think we've got this kind of dualistic view of history where, some people are very fixated on a sort of futuristic urban tech vision and so there's a sort of, you see that in art and a critique of it. And then it's very easy, it's very easy for the argument about small scale farming or local communities. It's very open to the critique of, oh, you're just romanticizing, you want to turn the clock back, you want to go back to this sort of miserable past. So I think, we of history and the passage of time and the role of certainly I think artists and writers are better than sort of dry old academics like me at sort of painting that world. But I wouldn't say that certainly in the UK, I wouldn't say that movement, I mean, maybe in some ways it is beginning to take off, and there are some people doing interesting stuff, but again, I think it's we're not as far down that road as I wish we were.
Yeah, I was quite excited a few months ago when I saw that a university student collective had created an earthworm exhibition here in London. And as someone who's an earthworm lover and soil lover, it felt radical or very new that art students were bringing earthworms into focus in the art realm in London. Yeah, I unfortunately didn't get to go because this year dictated many things like that, but I do think it seems to be shifting. We'll see how it'd be great to have the two more in conversation, I guess. Vandana, there's one question in here that's specifically for you, and I think, a lot of people who are not in India right now feel like, or we're seeing all the side news about the strikes that are going on, or the demonstrations that are going on, that are huge, and yet it's not being very clearly reported in the media. So B said, recently here in the States, we heard from alternative news outlets about the largest farmer strikes in India. Vandana, could you give us an update about the situation?
Well, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, 1984, there were similar protests in Punjab. And they were, a deflection was taken. It became a religious narrative. The Golden Temple was invaded, and the farmers' issue was forgotten. The people today are the children of the farmers who protested then. 91, when the World Bank and the early drafts of the GATT and WTO started, we had huge movements. I went to every farmer union of this country and explained patenting of seed, explained trade in agriculture, explained sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And we had rallies of 500,000, 200,000, saying food is too important to be left to trade and profiteering. And that's where the language of seed sovereignty and food sovereignty started to grow. I brought farmers from across the world, including the Koreans. You might remember there was a Korean farmer who committed suicide in the WTO meetings in Cancun to say, I am committing suicide to let the world know that there's a crisis of farmers, that farmers are facing a crisis. And that's exactly what they're fighting about now. They're basically saying, we'll stick here till you shoot us dead, because if you pass these laws of total deregulation, we're going to be dead anyway. So what happened yesterday was Republic Day of India, and a totally orchestrated invasion of the Red Fort was done. because the farmers had announced a parade, a tractor parade. The parade was peaceful. The farmers' protest over 2 months has been totally peaceful. And this to me took me back to 84, where exactly in the same way, a deflection took place, a criminalization of farmers took place. 30,000 people had died in 84, in that period in Punjab. And right now, for a very peaceful movement to continue to be able to tell its story in authenticity, where now the loaded media is deflecting it, that's the challenge. And I think for all of us, that's the challenge. That here is this amazing work being done all over, in 3 of us from 3 continents, and sharing the same vision. And yet, look at BBC and what they talk about in terms of the future of agriculture. Yeah. I mean, for those who are working on care for the land, harvesting your tomatoes is not a painful task. But all of the thing is we'll get robots to relieve the farmer of hard work. But they've been trying to relieve us of hard work forever till they've made everyone jobless. And I think that narrative of work as drudgery rather than work as liberation is part of the new narrative that we must tell. And it's so much of the fossil fuel story, yeah, that it had to define every bit of autonomous work by people as drudgery and real slave work as progress. And now they're reaching the stage with robotics and artificial intelligence. We don't need people. 99% of you are useless. So our farmers are seeing the past. They've lived through 30 years of globalization and neoliberal deregulation, and they can see what the future will be. They know they won't have a place, and they don't want to be disposable because they're proud farmers. They take pride in their work. So it's a very, and I think nobody should see the Indian farmers' protest as Indian for 2 reasons. First, every 4th farmer of the world is an Indian because we have fought to stay small farmers. We have fought against the mythology of large farms are productive. We've defended the smallness. We've celebrated smallness. And so every 4th farmer is an Indian. But also, whether it was the Green Revolution in 65 or neoliberal agriculture in 91 or Bill Gates and digital agriculture, India or East India Company in the beginning, India for some reason has always been where the experiment of greed in a new colonization always comes. I think it's because the land is so generous, people are so hardworking, and we are a very big economy, just that it's not counted. So the Indian farmers' protests are really global protests. And, Chris, it's about small farmers. It's a small farmer future the farmers are defending. And Leah, it is about continuing the fight against the East India Company that captured Africans to work as slaves on land grabbed from the indigenous people. That empire of cotton is today the empire of bad food. And all of the struggles are one. And I think our duty is to not allow the story of the Indian farmers' protest to be ghettoized and to build it and link it to our stories wherever we are, because it is relevant.
Yeah, could I just add quickly to that? I mean, that was so beautifully put that, so often there's this narrative that nobody wants to be a farmer, and it's just so important to bear witness historically to, throughout the world, here in England, in the Americas, in India, so many places that people have just fought and are fighting so hard to retain access to land for so many different reasons. But but that point about autonomy is really key. And I think this is going to be increasingly the case that the idea that you could get more freedom by not being a farmer is increasingly not the case. So but it's really key just to bear witness to the extent to which people have fought for access to land just to feed themselves and their households.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. I feel like quite moved by what you just said and bringing it all together. You know, we are all, it is the same in many ways. It's what the Indian farmers are standing up for is what we're all standing up for. And you've really like spurred me to now go and spread the word on that more than ever and really get as many people recognizing and in action about showing their support for that, I guess. And I think one thing you said there, you know, that they're going to stay there till they, you know, either they win or they die, because they're going to die anyway if the deregulation comes in. That feels like an amazing, you know, they're making an amazing stand, and that really hits home just how strongly they, you know, you feel and they feel about this whole thing. And actually we really need to honor that and stand by them as much as possible. So thank you for really communicating that so clearly. And yeah, and also just standing by the small farmers everywhere and anywhere is taking action in that way. Yeah.
And Abby, just one more little idea. You know, you've got such an important Extinction Rebellion going on. I think the threat of extinction of the small farmer is the foundation of all other extinctions. Because only the small farmer who has the possibility and potential to care.
Mm-hmm.
Not just for the land, but all the species that depend on the land. So if all those other movements can wake up to this, and so we cannot allow the extinction of the small farmer, we need the opposite. We need everyone to be a farmer directly or indirectly, you know, and to really have more people on the land. You know, we need 50, according to me, we need 50% directly taking care of the land, and the rest supported and supporting the 50%.
Yep, I got that. And it is, yeah, I think, well, the Extinction Rebellion movement here in the UK, it's probably, well, particularly in the UK right now with the Brexit situation, there's an opportunity for land grabbing as such, potentially. And so I think the more we can emphasize the importance of not having more land centralization more centralization of land ownership in this country, you know, that really is a good starting point for the Extinction Rebellion movement in the UK anyway, and obviously is reflected in many different ways around the world. Okay, there are a lot of questions here, and I think this is quite an interesting one in the sense that I think we did touch on this before. But I think that it is something that, you know, when people think about the concept of Indigenous, a little bit what you were talking about before, Chris, they go back to, oh, well, who are the people here originally or first? And I think Anand asked the question, you know, do you think that Indigenous is impractical when 80% of people are immigrants with mostly no or less land?
Sorry, that was a question to me. Where are we talking about?
Yeah, to any of you, but I guess it's this concept of like, you know, people thinking they can't be Indigenous or they can't re-indigenize because we're, you know, immigrants. Like, for example, I'm an immigrant in the UK. I'm not from here. My family has no lineage here or anything. So what would it mean to be Indigenous in the UK?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, and I mean, part of what I try and argue in the book is that, you know, like I was saying, I think if we, you know, it's so dependent on context. But if here in the UK, I think a kind of here first indigeneity argument is just going to lead us into endless worlds of trouble. I mean, it was interesting that there was a couple of reviews of my book from people in Wales, and it was an interesting session I did with Jane Davidson, another Chelsea Green author who was a Minister for Environment in the Welsh government. And, you know, I think, you know, I think we are facing a reality of people will be moving out of the cities in the future looking for rural areas, and there's a kind of, you know, if it's basically a bunch of rich English people from London like trying to find a nice bit of land in Wales, you know, that is you know, that is a recipe for enormous conflict. I mean, that's already going to happen to some extent. So I suppose part of what I'm trying to argue in the book is sort of to make a virtue out of the crisis is that you know, it's immigration. You know, we're going to have people from so many different backgrounds and you know, origins that you know, part of it is about learning to live in place, so that is going to involve connecting with what the local farming traditions were, because, you know, essentially every part of the world has figured out a kind of low impact, low energy farm ecology that we have to tap into. But you know, part of it is bringing new knowledges and new traditions, which farmers have always done. You know, culture and agriculture are inherently sort of changing and fluid and learning. But it's also, I mean, hopefully, you know, it's not hard to see how the crises that we're facing are going to lead into, or are already leading into, various kind of sort of resurgences of nationalism and nativism. But, you know, the other side of that is that, you know, modernity has basically failed, and it's failed everybody, and we have to reconfigure this completely from the ground up. So you know, I'm not trying to suggest that that the inequalities behind that are irrelevant, but there's an element of being in the same boat. And I think that's got to be that's partly got to be about land reform. So that goes back to Leah's points about historical land injustice. I mean, you know, we need to stop land concentrating. We need to keep you know, we need to keep it available to everybody. And there is, I mean, I talk about it in various ways in the book, traditions of civic republicanism and so on. You know, we have the tools to do that. It's partly about, you know, the way the politics works out. But, you know, that is the challenge. You know, you can't sort of write, you know, you can't sort of solve it in the abstract. You have to solve it in the politics on the ground. And, you know, that's going to be the challenge. But I don't think a lack of, you know, however you want to define indigeneity, certainly in a UK context, you know, that is not an obstacle intrinsically to getting onto the land and you know, rethinking how we are providing our livelihoods and producing right livelihoods.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, I think I wanted to end there and just offer you each the opportunity for any like final remarks or closing ideas or anything you'd like to share that hasn't been shared. It'd be great to hear a final sentiment from each of you. Maybe Leah, you want to go first there?
Sure, I just want to share that in Indigenous West African cosmology, there's a sense of reciprocity between the earth and human beings. In that, meaning the love goes both ways. And something that's been really powerful for me is to meditate upon the truth that the earth loves me back. Just as I love her, she also loves me back. And I welcome folks to sit in the possibility of endless belonging and endless worthiness that's offered by that sentiment.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I mean, I can't wait. That sounds amazing. Vandana, any final?
You know, my work the last 35 years has been a dedication of seeding liberation of the land. And the earth does love us deeply and is inviting us to her love and service. And that's the reason for me, all of these people who want to continue to play domination games, because they're afraid of life in freedom. You know, that's what it ultimately is about. And I'm offering a dialogue on 7th and another on seed, you know, seed freedom, I think from the 13th to the 15th of February. So let's continue this work and let's be there to be the voices of those whose voices are either ignored or drowned out in the noise.
Thank you. Yeah, great invitation to continue the conversation. I think Ruby posted some links to those conversations in the beginning, and they'll be coming out on the email tomorrow as well, so people can access that. Oh, there we go. Posted again, all the links. And Chris, final thoughts.
So many things to think about from the discussion. I mean, one thing that's been in my mind is Noah McDonald, who I think has been at Soulfire Farm, and I was listening to his presentation on YouTube about African history and the way that was sort of taken through African American history, and he used the term kinship-based commons as a way of thinking about how we relate to the land. And you know, both of those terms I think are so full of meaning, you know, kinship with in our immediate settings, but kinship with people more widely, kinship with the earth, the ways in which we work together, the ways in which, you know, we work more autonomously. So I just think, you know, I found his presentation really fascinating, and I think that concept of kinship-based commons, I think, can go in all sorts of different ways, in all sorts, you know, for different people in different contexts. So I think just thinking about kinship and commons in general is a really good way of thinking through some of these issues.
Brilliant, great words. Kinship and commons. I know Leah has to go, so to Leah, thank you so much, and thank you also, Vandana. I'm sure you're keen to get to sleep. Thank you for all your.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Chris, and I think Ruby's just going to come in here at the end and share some final words. And thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the wisdom and generosity of all speakers today, Chris, Vandana, and Leah, and Abby, you as well. It's been amazing to hear from you all, and so much depth and breadth, and from 3 very different regions as well, different parts of the globe, and those different perspectives have just been a huge insight to all of us, and thank you to all of our audience who's joined us as well. We've had almost 300 people sign up, which is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series and the journey that we'll all go on together. So thank you again. And I've put in the chat already all of the courses for the different speakers, but I'm going to add again the links for their books as well. If you haven't read their books yet, then we really recommend that you do, because yeah, there you go. They're great. Yeah, so thank you again, and look forward to seeing you all next week. And and I'm gonna write an email tomorrow, and I'll send the link to the recording. If you want to watch it again, you can do that. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.